January 17, 1945. Western Europe. Late afternoon. A thin winter sun hangs low over open farmland, scarred by months of war. The ground is hard, frozen into shallow ridges by tank tracks and shell craters. Smoke drifts lazily across the fields, not from a barrage, but from engines idling, dozens of them, lined nose to tail behind a shallow rise. Inside American tanks, men wait in silence. Hands rest on cold steel levers. Periscopes sweep a quiet horizon. There is no shouting, no rush, only the steady vibration of engines and the ticking of watches synced hours earlier. Ahead lies a German defensive line, trenches, anti-tank guns, roadblocks, and infantry positions dug in with care. It has held through artillery. It has held through probing attacks. According to maps and doctrine, it should hold through today. But this afternoon is different. Orders move quickly through radio headsets, short and precise. Engines rev. Steel columns begin to roll forward, not cautiously, but with intent. The tanks do not stop to fire and withdraw. They advance. They accelerate. Infantry follows in their wake. Within hours, the line that was meant to slow the Allied advance for days will no longer exist. And as the sun drops behind the smoke, something fundamental about the war in the West is about to change. By the winter of 1944-1945, the war in Western Europe had entered a decisive phase. The German army was no longer fighting to win in the strategic sense. It was fighting to delay. Every river line, every village, every hedgerow became a temporary barrier meant to buy time, time for reserves that no longer existed, time for fuel that would never arrive, time for political outcomes that were increasingly detached from reality. The Allied armies, meanwhile, had transformed. The slow, costly lessons of 1942 and 1943 had reshaped how the United States fought on the ground. Early encounters in North Africa had exposed weaknesses in American armor, poor coordination, unreliable communications, and an over-reliance on doctrine unsuited to fluid battlefields. Those failures were studied carefully. By 1944, U.S. armored units no longer operated as blunt instruments. They functioned as integrated systems. At the center of this system was the concept of combined arms. Tanks no longer advanced alone. Infantry rode on hulls or followed closely behind. Artillery was pre-registered and flexible. Air power, when weather allowed, was coordinated down to specific time windows. Most critically, radios connected every level of command, allowing momentum to be exploited rather than lost. Germany's defensive doctrine, by contrast, had become increasingly rigid. Earlier in the war, German commanders had relied on elastic defense, trading space for time, counterattacking with mobile reserves. By late 1944, this flexibility had largely disappeared. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units. Experienced officers had been killed or transferred east. Orders from higher command increasingly demanded that ground be held at all costs, regardless of local conditions. The result was the creation of lines, not in the sense of continuous fortifications, but in layered positions tied to roads, villages, and natural obstacles. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover open approaches. Infantry dug in along reverse slopes. Mines and obstacles were laid where material allowed. These positions were not meant to stop an armored army permanently, but to slow it, bleed it, and force it to deploy cautiously. American planners were well aware of these methods. Intelligence reports described German units as depleted, but still dangerous when given time to prepare. The expectation was not a breakthrough in hours, but a measured advance, probe, engage, suppress, then advance again. Yet the broader situation was forcing a change in tempo. The failed German offensive in the Ardennes had cost the Wehrmacht men, tanks, and irreplaceable fuel. In its aftermath, Allied commanders sought to regain the initiative quickly, before German units could reorganize along new defensive belts. Speed was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. Weather, which had grounded Allied aircraft for weeks, began to improve. Roads hardened under frost. Supply lines, strained in the autumn, stabilized. For the first time since the summer, American armored divisions were in position to move with sustained force. In this environment, a defensive line was no longer judged by how carefully it was constructed, but by how quickly it could be overwhelmed. And it was in this narrow window, between German exhaustion and Allied momentum, that the events of a single afternoon would unfold. The sector chosen for the advance was not, on paper, extraordinary. It was a stretch of rolling ground broken by small villages, shallow streams, and road junctions that mattered more for movement than for symbolism. German maps marked it as a delaying position, strong enough to punish a careless assault, but not intended to become a final stand. For the Americans, it represented something else entirely, an opportunity to test whether speed itself could become a weapon. Facing the line were elements of a U.S. armored division that had already seen months of combat. Its crews were no longer green. They had fought through hedgerows in Normandy, maneuvered across open plains in France, and endured the chaos of the German counteroffensive weeks earlier. Losses had been replaced, but experience had accumulated. Commanders at battalion and company level understood not just how to fight, but when to press and when to bypass. Opposing them were German infantry formations drawn from a mixture of regular army units and hastily reorganized remnants. Paper strength rarely matched reality. Rifle companies that should have fielded over 100 men often mustered half that number. Heavy weapons were present, but ammunition was rationed. Anti-tank guns, still dangerous, were fewer in number and increasingly dependent on static positioning rather than maneuver. Crucially, the German line lacked depth. Earlier defensive systems had relied on successive fallback positions, allowing units to disengage under pressure and reform. By January 1945, this was often impossible. There were no fresh units waiting behind the line. Withdrawal, if it came, would be improvised and contested. American intelligence officers studying aerial photographs and prisoner interrogations noticed this fragility. Trenches appeared well dug, but sparsely manned. Gun pits were present, but not always supported by infantry screens. Communications between German units were inconsistent, often relying on runners rather than radio. What looked solid on a map concealed gaps that could be exploited if pressure was applied fast enough. This understanding shaped the plan. Rather than a prolonged artillery preparation followed by cautious advance, the operation emphasized immediate armored thrust. Artillery would support movement, not replace it. Tanks would advance in mass, using speed and coordination to deny defenders the time needed to react effectively. The risk was acknowledged. Tanks advancing too far without infantry could be ambushed. Anti-tank guns, even in small numbers, could still destroy vehicles at close range. But the greater danger lay in hesitation. Every pause allowed the defenders to recover, reposition, and stiffen resistance. Orders reflected this urgency. Battalion commanders were given clear objectives and broad freedom to exploit success. Radio discipline was emphasized. Once the attack began, it would not stop unless resistance made movement physically impossible. As dawn faded into afternoon, engines were warmed, formations aligned, and final checks completed. The German line ahead was quiet, not because it was unaware, but because it expected the familiar rhythm of battle,
bombardment, probing attacks, time. What it did not expect was that the Americans would attempt to erase the line altogether in a matter of hours. That realization would come too late when the first tanks crested the rise and did not slow down.
Inside the advancing tanks, the war was reduced to confined spaces and repetitive motions. Crews worked by muscle memory, load, traverse, adjust, fire. The cold seeped through steel hulls, numbing fingers despite gloves. Condensation gathered on periscopes, wiped away with practiced impatience. These men were not thinking in grand strategy. They were thinking in meters, seconds, and silhouettes on the horizon. Most crews had learned caution the hard way. Normandy had taught them that every hedgerow could hide a gun. The autumn battles had shown how quickly confidence could turn into loss. Yet this afternoon demanded something different. Speed required trust that the infantry would follow, that artillery would lift when promised, that the tank on the flank would not suddenly vanish in smoke. Infantrymen moving behind the armor experienced the advance differently. Tanks provided cover, but also drew fire. German rounds cracked overhead, snapping into frozen earth. The noise was constant, engines, tracks, machine guns, so loud that shouted commands were useless. Men advanced by signals, glances, instinct. Fear was present but controlled, shaped by routine and repetition. For both groups, the sensation was not of a dramatic charge, but of relentless forward motion. Positions that would once have required careful clearing were bypassed or suppressed. The psychological effect was immediate. German fire, effective in isolation, lost coherence under continuous pressure. Crews sensed it without needing reports. Resistance felt thinner, less organized, breakable. The attack unfolded as a moving problem rather than a fixed plan. Tanks advanced in bounds, covering one another while maintaining momentum. When resistance appeared, it was not allowed to define the pace. A gun position was engaged directly or marked for follow-on elements. Infantry dealt with what the tanks could not, but neither arm waited for the other to finish completely. Artillery played a critical role, not through massive barrages, but through precision. Forward observers rode with the lead elements, calling in fire on crossroads, suspected gun lines, and rear areas. These strikes were brief and timed to movement, preventing German units from reorganizing. Smoke rounds obscured open ground at key moments, denying defenders clear fields of fire. Equally important was what did not happen. There was no long pause to consolidate gains, no extended halt to realign. Commanders accepted imperfect information in exchange for speed. Gaps were widened instead of sealed. Strong points were isolated rather than reduced immediately. This approach exploited a fundamental weakness in the German defense, its reliance on coordination. Anti-tank guns were effective when integrated with infantry and observation. Once separated and pressured from multiple directions, they became vulnerable. A line designed to absorb and channel attacks began to fragment under sustained movement. By mid-afternoon, what had been a continuous defensive position existed only in fragments, each still dangerous but no longer mutually supporting. American tanks were not invulnerable. Their armor could be penetrated. Their guns were not always superior on paper, but their strength lay in reliability and communication. Radios functioned consistently, allowing crews and commanders to react instantly. Mechanical breakdowns still occurred, but less frequently than earlier in the war, and recovery teams followed closely behind. Fuel and ammunition flowed forward with the advance. Logistics, often invisible in combat narratives, made speed possible. Vehicles that ran dry could be replaced. Damaged tanks could be bypassed without halting the formation. The system absorbed loss without collapsing. For the German defenders, technology told a different story. Guns lacked mobility.
Vehicles, when present, were short on fuel. Communications failed under pressure. What had once been a technologically sophisticated army now fought with diminishing means. As these imbalances compounded, the line's collapse became not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulating inevitability, one driven as much by systems as by bravery. And as the afternoon wore on, leadership decisions, made minutes at a time, would determine whether this momentum could be sustained.
Leadership during the advance was exercised less through speeches and more through restraint. Battalion and company commanders resisted the instinct to over-control. Orders were short, objectives were clear, but methods were left to those closest to the ground. This trust was not accidental. It had been built through months of combat and reinforced by training that emphasized initiative over rigid compliance. Decisions were made in moving vehicles over radios filled with static and urgency. When resistance stiffened, leaders faced a choice: pause to reduce it methodically, or press around it and risk exposure. Increasingly, they chose the latter. The assumption was simple: momentum was protection. A stationary tank was a target. A moving formation was a problem the enemy struggled to solve. German leadership operated under different constraints. Local commanders often recognized the danger quickly, but lacked freedom of action. Orders to hold ground limited withdrawal. Requests for reinforcement went unanswered. Communication with higher headquarters, when possible, produced instructions detached from immediate reality. In some sectors, officers acted on their own initiative to pull back. In others, they did not, and units were overtaken where they stood. This divergence in command culture, flexible exploitation versus rigid adherence, accelerated the breakdown of the defensive line. From the German perspective, the attack did not feel like a single blow, but like a series of shocks arriving faster than they could be processed. Tanks appeared where they were not expected. Fire came from unexpected angles. Positions prepared to face a frontal assault found themselves bypassed, isolated, or attacked from the rear. Anti-tank crews fought effectively when given the chance. Some guns knocked out lead vehicles, forcing brief halts. But without depth or mobility, these successes were fleeting. Once revealed, gun positions drew concentrated fire. Ammunition ran low. Crews withdrew on foot or were captured as American infantry closed in. Morale suffered unevenly. Veteran soldiers understood what was happening and attempted to disengage early. Less experienced troops clung to positions, waiting for orders that never arrived. The sense of fighting within a coherent front dissolved. The battlefield became a series of local crises, each disconnected from the next. Psychologically, speed carried its own weight. For American forces, forward motion reinforced confidence. Each kilometer gained without decisive resistance confirmed that the method was working. Fear remained, but it was overlaid with purpose. There was no time to dwell on losses. For the German defenders, the effect was corrosive. Defensive warfare relies on predictability, knowing where support lies, where withdrawal is possible, where the line exists. As those certainties vanished, so did cohesion. Rumors spread faster than orders. The sound of engines behind positions created panic disproportionate to actual numbers. By the time the sun began to sink, many German soldiers no longer perceived themselves as part of a line at all. They were individuals trying to survive a moving battlefield that no longer followed familiar rules. This psychological shift mattered as much as terrain gained or guns destroyed, because once belief in the line collapsed, its physical remnants became irrelevant. And it was at this point, when resistance shifted from organized defense to fragmented reaction, that the afternoon reached its decisive phase. The decisive phase began quietly.
By early afternoon, lead American elements had already moved beyond positions marked on their maps as the main line of resistance. There was no clear signal that a breakthrough had occurred, no dramatic order, no sudden collapse. Instead, it revealed itself through absence. Fire that should have met them did not. Roads that should have been blocked lay open. Radio reports from forward units grew shorter, then more confident. At approximately 1400 hours, armored columns pushed into ground the Germans had assumed would not be reached until nightfall. Tank commanders noted abandoned equipment along the verges, ammunition crates, personal gear, a disabled gun with its crew gone. These were not signs of defeat in the traditional sense. They were signs of a defense overtaken by time. German attempts to re-establish cohesion came too late. Small counterattacks were launched with whatever forces could be gathered, an assault gun here, a handful of infantry there. These actions were brave and in some cases effective, but they lacked synchronization. Each engagement was isolated, defeated in turn by concentrated fire and maneuver. Artillery now shifted deeper, striking road junctions and likely withdrawal routes. Smoke obscured crossings as tanks pressed through, their silhouettes briefly outlined against drifting clouds. Infantry secured key villages not through house-to-house fighting, but by arriving faster than defenders could organize resistance. By mid-afternoon, commanders on both sides understood that something irreversible was unfolding. American units were no longer fighting through a line, they were moving beyond it. German reports spoke of penetrations and fluid situations, language that masked a harsher reality. The defensive framework had failed. The critical moment came not with a single destroyed gun or overrun trench, but with the realization that there was no second line to fall back to. What remained were fragments, capable of inflicting losses, but incapable of stopping the advance. As the afternoon wore on, the question was no longer whether the line could be restored. It was how much could be salvaged before darkness. By late afternoon, the battlefield had stretched beyond the ability of German commanders to comprehend it in real time. Reports arrived late or not at all. Units described American tanks behind their former positions on roads that were supposed to be secure. Requests for clarification went unanswered, not out of neglect, but because higher headquarters no longer possessed a coherent picture themselves. The American advance accelerated. What had begun as an armored thrust widened into a rolling front. Tanks moved through gaps that had not existed hours earlier, fanning out to seize crossroads, bridges, and villages whose names appeared only as symbols on operational maps that morning. Infantry followed, consolidating what speed had opened, capturing stragglers and cutting off small pockets of resistance. German forces attempted to withdraw, but withdrawal itself had become dangerous. Roads were exposed. Columns were intercepted by armor advancing along parallel routes. Artillery fire disrupted movement, forcing units to abandon vehicles and heavy weapons. Men escaped on foot where they could, moving cross-country through fields already crossed by enemy tanks. By approximately 1700 hours, daylight began to fade. Shadows lengthened across the frozen ground, and with them came a final realization. The defensive line no longer existed in any functional sense. It had not been reduced systematically. It had not been encircled in a textbook maneuver. It had been overtaken, its logic invalidated by tempo. For American commanders, this moment required discipline. Success carried its own dangers. Units were ordered to secure flanks, establish blocking positions, and prepare for the night. Yet even these consolidations occurred forward of where the line had been expected to hold until the following day. The German response was fragmented and local. Some officers ordered immediate withdrawal to avoid encirclement.
Others held on, awaiting instructions that never arrived. In several areas, resistance simply dissolved as soldiers surrendered to advancing infantry, exhausted and aware that the battle had moved past them. By nightfall, the map told a story that words struggled to match. In the space of a single afternoon, a prepared defensive position intended to delay the Allied advance for days had been erased, not through overwhelming numbers alone, but through coordination, speed, and a willingness to abandon the rhythms of earlier fighting. The turning point was complete. What followed would determine how fully this rupture could be exploited and what price would be paid for it.
When the firing finally subsided, the scale of what had occurred became clearer in its details rather than its totals. Prisoners were gathered in small groups along roadsides, men from different units, some without weapons, others still wearing winter camouflage smudged with mud and exhaust. Their accounts, taken separately, told the same story. The attack had moved too fast to understand, let alone stop. Material losses reflected the nature of the collapse. Anti-tank guns were found abandoned or destroyed where they stood, their fields of fire rendered irrelevant by the direction of the advance. Vehicles were left intact but unusable, out of fuel or disabled by hurried retreat. Ammunition dumps, discovered unexpectedly by forward elements, confirmed how little time defenders had to evacuate. American casualties, though significant, were lower than anticipated for an assault of this depth. Losses were concentrated at points of initial resistance, where German guns had been properly sighted and crews stood their ground. But once the line fragmented, the rate of loss dropped sharply. Momentum, as commanders had hoped, reduced exposure. Operationally, the immediate consequence was space. Units that had expected to halt and reorganize instead found themselves ordered forward again. Bridges were secured intact, road networks fell into Allied hands, supply columns adjusted routes overnight, exploiting ground that had not been scheduled for use until later phases of the campaign. For the German army, the aftermath was defined by absence. There was no organized counterstroke, no immediate attempt to reestablish a coherent front in the sector. Reserves that might once have been committed simply did not exist. What remained were orders to delay where possible and to withdraw to the next available terrain feature, often without clarity on where that would be. Reports sent up the chain of command acknowledged the loss cautiously, describing it as a temporary setback or a localized penetration, yet the language could not disguise the reality on the ground. A line had failed, not gradually, but catastrophically. As night fell, both sides prepared for what came next. The Americans braced for counterattacks that never materialized. The Germans focused on survival, moving, hiding, regrouping in the dark. And in the quiet that followed, the implications of the afternoon began to extend beyond the battlefield itself. In the days that followed, the rupture widened. What had been a localized breakthrough became a sustained advance, built upon the momentum of that single afternoon. American armored units pressed forward, not recklessly, but with confidence shaped by recent success. The expectation of resistance remained, but the assumption that a fixed line could halt them had been broken. German attempts to stabilize the situation focused on natural obstacles, rivers, forested high ground, urban areas where armor could be constrained. Yet these measures were increasingly reactive. Without time to prepare layered defenses, each new position inherited the same vulnerability as the last. It could be overtaken before it fully existed. Command reports from the German side reflected a shift in tone. References to holding actions gave way to mobile delay, a recognition that static defense was no longer viable in the face of Allied mobility and firepower. This adjustment came late and under pressure, implemented by units already depleted and short of resources.
For the Allies, the success reinforced doctrinal lessons that would shape the remainder of the campaign. Speed, when combined with coordination, could achieve what prolonged bombardment could not. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and logistics, operating as a unified system, could collapse defenses designed to resist each element in isolation. The psychological impact extended upward. Senior commanders took note of how quickly prepared positions could dissolve under sustained movement. Planning assumptions were revised, timelines shortened, objectives expanded. What had been expected to require deliberate set-piece battles was now seen as potentially achievable through continuous pressure. At the human level, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. For American soldiers, the advance blurred into a series of long days and short nights, marked by exhaustion and cautious optimism. For German soldiers, the experience lingered as a lesson in helplessness, of being overrun not by superior courage alone, but by a system that no longer allowed recovery. This afternoon did not end the war in the West, but it demonstrated with brutal clarity that the era of holding ground through static lines had passed. And that realization would echo far beyond this battlefield, into the final months of the conflict and into the future of warfare itself.
The destruction of the line in a single afternoon was not an accident of circumstance, nor the result of a single bold decision. It was the culmination of years of adaptation, of doctrines tested, broken, and rebuilt under fire. What unfolded that day revealed a fundamental shift in how wars were no longer just fought, but decided. The German army had once mastered movement, surprise, and tempo. In earlier years, it had shattered opponents by refusing to fight on predictable terms. By 1945, those same principles were turned against it. Lacking fuel, reserves, and freedom of command, its defenses became fixed not by design, but by necessity. Lines were drawn because there was nothing left to maneuver with. The American army, often underestimated in the early years of the war, had learned quickly. It learned that armor without infantry was vulnerable, that firepower without coordination was wasteful, and that caution without speed invited defeat. Most importantly, it learned to trust systems, to let radios, logistics, and decentralized leadership carry momentum forward. This afternoon demonstrated that modern battlefields no longer rewarded static endurance, they punished hesitation. A line could be carefully prepared, well-sighted, and bravely defended, and still cease to exist if it could not adapt to movement imposed upon it. For the men involved, the memory was not one of triumph alone, but of relentless motion, of engines that did not stop, of maps that changed faster than ink could dry, of realizing only after nightfall that something expected to last days had vanished in hours. History often marks its turning points with dates and names, but some are defined by tempo, by the speed at which certainty collapses. And on that winter afternoon, as darkness settled over broken ground and silent guns, the future of warfare rolled forward on steel tracks, leaving the old lines behind forever.